Some mysteries start with a dramatic event. Kyron Horman starts with something quieter. It's a series of small clues that shouldn't mean anything on their own, but together form one of the most unsettling puzzles in modern American history. Here's the first clue. At 8:45 a.m., Kyron Horman is photographed inside his school. He's alive, smiling, standing proudly beside his science fair project. Now, by 3:30 that afternoon, the school bus arrives without him, and staff insist he'd been absent the entire day. So, we have a photo of him at the science fair and an absence. Two official stories that can't coexist. Clue number 2. The adult who brought Kyron to school gives a pretty straightforward timeline. Science fair, a walk towards the classroom, followed by a routine day of errands. But when investigators take a closer look, that timeline seems to fall apart. A morning with missing minutes. Clue number 3. Skyline Elementary was full that morning. Teachers, parents, volunteers, students. The hallways were crowded and people were everywhere, yet not one reliable witness can place Kyron inside the building after that last photograph. I'm Genua, and you're watching America's Strangest History. These clues are only the beginning. As the investigation expands, more appear. Too many clues, not enough answers. A family under strain, suspicious communications, search areas that produce nothing, also a civil lawsuit. We've got court documents that reveal previously undisclosed pieces of the timeline, a series of behaviors before and after June 4th that raise questions. This is the disappearance of Kyron Horman. It's a case built on clues, wrapped in confusion. Before we follow the clues, we need to understand the world Kyron lived in, not the headlines or the speculation. I'm talking about the actual people, the circumstances that shaped the morning of June 4th, 2010. Let's start with a look at the family. Kyron Horman, 7 years old, a second grader at Skyline Elementary, soft-spoken, curious. He loved school, which makes the attendance anomaly later that day even more alarming. Desiree Young, Kyron's biological mother, a former law enforcement employee, by all accounts deeply devoted to her son. Desiree shared custody early on, but significant health issues forced her to step back temporarily, leaving Kyron's father to become the primary custodial parent. Kyron Horman, Kyron's father, is an engineer working for Intel, organized, structured, methodical, the type of parent who keeps tight routines and has firm expectations. In the years before his disappearance, Kane's home became Kyron's everyday world. Terry Moulton Horman, Kane's then-wife, Kyron's stepmother. Terry's the adult who drove Kyron to school on June 4th. She took the photo of him at the science fair. She's a former substitute teacher. For years, she handled the day-to-day parenting like school drop-offs, lunch, homework, medical appointments. She managed the household. Terry eventually became the center of the investigation. Finally, baby Kay, Kane and Terry's infant daughter. She was in the truck with Terry during the school drop-off and for much of that day. Now the extended network. There were other people in the periphery, more characters. Dee Dee Speecher, close friend of Terry. She'll appear later on in the timeline. We've got teachers and staff who interacted with Kyron at school on the very same day he was marked absent. There's search and rescue coordinators. And of course, a community that suddenly found itself trying to make sense of something that seemed impossible, a missing child with no trail. As far as the setting, where all this went down, Skyline Elementary. It's a rural school northwest of Portland, surrounded by hills, forests, winding roads, and large stretches of private land. On the morning of June 4th, Skyline was unusually busy. Parents were allowed in early for science fair. Hallways were crowded, doors were open, kids were moving between classrooms, and attendance wasn't taken in the strict, structured way that it would be on a normal day. So, it was the perfect environment for a clue to go unnoticed. At the same time, Kyron's home life was more complicated than many realized. In the weeks before his disappearance, tensions inside the Horman household were rising. Arguments, unspoken issues, a marriage under pressure, private conflicts that would later become part of the civil lawsuit and court filings. In most missing child cases, these seemingly simple relational details narrow the field dramatically. To understand how a child can disappear inside a public school, we have to walk through the morning exactly as investigators did, step by step, minute by minute, detail by detail. 8 a.m. was the drop-off, Friday, June 4th. Terry loads Kyron and her infant daughter into her white Ford F-250, and she drives the familiar route towards Skyline Elementary. Now, Terry's traveled the route hundreds of times. Kyron arrives at school excited. He's been rehearsing his science fair presentation, and today is the first time the public will see it. There's no dispute that Kyron arrived at Skyline that morning. Multiple witnesses place him on campus. Then there's the picture taken at 8:45 a.m. that proves it. Terry took a photo of Kyron at the science fair. He looks happy. That part of the timeline is firm. 8:10 to 8:45 a.m. is the science fair walkthrough. Inside the school, the atmosphere is different from a normal day. Parents are inside the building. Students wander between classrooms. Teachers are occupied. It's crowded, noisy, and unstructured. Terry walks Kyron through the halls. She stops at exhibits, speaks with students and parents. She makes her way towards the library area where Kyron's project's displayed. Several people recall seeing them together. Some remember Kyron's enthusiasm, some remember Terry talking about the project. No one recalls anything unusual. At 8:45 a.m., Terry takes the photograph that will become the most circulated image in the entire case. The final confirmed sighting of Kyron Horman. This is clue number 1, the place where the world can see him and the last moment anyone can confirm where he was. A little after 8:45 a.m., after the photograph, Terry later tells investigators that she walked Kyron towards his classroom. Not all the way inside, just towards it. She says she watched him head down the hallway towards his room, then turned back and headed towards the parking lot with her infant daughter. Now, this is the first unverified moment in the timeline. Now, no witnesses confirm seeing Kyron after this hallway movement. No teacher remembers him entering the classroom. No student recalls sitting near him at his desk. No staff member saw him outside the room. No hall monitor or volunteer remembers anything after this point. This isn't an accusation. It's a fact documented in interviews, affidavits, and early investigative reports. There's no confirmed sighting of Kyron after Terry's account of the hallway. It's a critical clue, because at this moment, the timeline splits into two paths. Either Kyron entered the classroom unnoticed, or he never made it inside and something happened before he reached the door. Investigators have never been able to settle that question. 8:50 to 9 a.m. The science fair continues. Staff begin transitioning to the regular school day. Schedules resume. Students should be in their classrooms. This is where the system breaks down. Skyline Elementary didn't take attendance in the strict sense that morning. Teachers assumed students were still exploring exhibits. Some assumed Kyron was with the science fair groups. Others assumed that he was in another classroom. Assumptions replaced verification. By the time attendance was officially entered, Kyron was marked absent. He was absent for the entire day. The school didn't notify Terry or Kane, and they didn't notify Desiree. This is clue number 2, a paper trail that contradicts the photographs taken less than an hour earlier. Between 9 and 10 a.m. are Terry's first movements. Terry leaves the school and begins what she describes as a typical morning. She's running errands, shopping for household items, picking up medication for the baby. Oddly enough, driving aimlessly to soothe an earache, then returning home later that morning. These are the broad strokes she provides about her morning. But when investigators reconstruct the drive times, the phone tower pings, and the store locations, they find gaps in the timeline, spaces where movements aren't supported by data or third-party sighting. This becomes clue number 3, not proof of wrongdoing, but a window of time that needs explaining. And 15 years later, the public still hasn't had a clear explanation. 10 a.m. to 1:21 p.m. The timeline from mid-morning to early afternoon is one of the most heavily scrutinized parts of this case. Terry says that she drove her infant daughter through the rural roads to soothe ear pain. Now, this is nearly a 90-minute stretch of driving that investigators ultimately described as difficult to corroborate. Around 1:21 p.m., Terry posts a science fair picture to Facebook. That's the one she took at 8:45 a.m. The timestamp becomes an anchor point in the timeline. Everything before that window and everything after circles back to it. So it begs the question, did anything significant happen between 8:45 a.m. and 1:21 p.m. that it could explain why Kyron never reached his classroom? 1:21 to 3 p.m. While Kyron's absence goes unnoticed at school, Terry runs routine errands. She communicates with friends and prepares for the afternoon. Inside Skyline, staff continue their day without realizing that they're missing a student. Remember, this was an event day. Children would drip between groups, and teachers assumed that they were with another adult. Schedules bend. In the chaos of that science fair, Kyron's absence was lost in the noise. 3:30 p.m. is the moment the alarm finally sounds. Terry and Kane walk to the bus stop expecting to see Kyron climb down the stairs like he always does. He's not there. The driver tells them Kyron wasn't at school at all. This is the moment the timeline implodes. The photograph says he was there. The school says he wasn't. The household expects him home, and he isn't. Within minutes, panic spreads. Calls are made, school staff begins searching the grounds, and by 4:33 p.m., law enforcement is notified. When the first deputies arrived at Skyline Elementary on the afternoon of June 4th, the case was still considered a routine missing child call, not a crime or a suspected abduction, just a child who hadn't gotten off the bus. But within minutes of walking around inside the school, deputies realized something is very wrong. This isn't a child who wandered from a playground or a student who got off the wrong bus. It isn't a mix-up with family members or an early pickup. This is a timeline problem, and for trained investigators, a broken timeline is one of the most serious red flags there is. There's a photograph showing Kyron inside the school. There's witnesses who saw him at the science fair, but there's no record of him making it to class. No confirmed sightings after the photo, and an attendance system quietly marked him absent. Deputies searched the school, but Skyline Elementary isn't a building filled with small, easily secured rooms. It's a patchwork of hallways, portable classrooms, storage areas, maintenance spaces, and entry points that open into a dense forest. Basically your worst case scenario. They checked every nook and corner of that school. Nothing. The search was expanded to the perimeter, the gym, the grounds, the adjoining areas, even places no child would normally go. Still nothing. This is where investigators encounter the first major clue. Kyron didn't appear to be anywhere on the school property. It's a chilling moment, because once a child can't be found inside the building and can't be found outside it, the possibilities narrow pretty quickly. Deputies cast a large net. Teachers, volunteers, parents, bus drivers, administrators, and the adults who brought the children to school that morning, all interviewed. Investigators asked the same questions dozens of times. Did anyone see Kyron after 8:45 a.m.? Did anyone walk into him in the classroom? Did anyone see him leave the building? Did anyone notice anything unusual? Did anyone see a stranger? But no one can place Kyron past that last photograph, and no one remembers anything that would indicate if he left the school with another adult. This is clue number 4, a disappearance that leaves behind no sensory footprint. For investigators trained to analyze behavior, movement, and human attention, this is highly unusual, because even when people don't realize that they're witnessing something significant, they tend to remember something, a noise, a direction, anything. Here they remember nothing. By nightfall, the case is no longer a routine missing child call. It becomes a full-scale search and rescue operation. Hundreds of trained searchers arrive. Dogs, all-terrain vehicles, mounted units, helicopters, teams combing ravines, culverts, wooded slopes, everywhere surrounding the school. The terrain around Skyline is unforgiving, but if Kyron simply wandered off, search teams should have found clothing, footprints, maybe a trail, certainly his scent, anything that pointed them in the right direction. But nothing's found. Not a single physical item. No scent trail a dog can reliably follow. Not a single sign that Kyron left school on foot. This became clue number 5. A missing child search with no trace of a missing child. It's not inconceivable that a child didn't leave the school on foot. Maybe he left by vehicle. And if that happened, it raises one more critical question. Who would Kyron willingly leave with? As darkness settles over the hilltops around Skyline, investigators turn their attention to the immediate family. Now, not because they assume wrongdoing, but because statistically, in unresolved disappearances involving children, the answers almost always begin with the people closest to them. Detectives speak with Kyron Horman, Desiree Young, and Terry Moulton Horman, the adult who dropped Kyron off at school that morning. The same adult that went for a drive to soothe an earache and whose timeline has a bunch of gaps. Police ask for minute-by-minute recollections, movements, conversations, recent stressors, changes in the home, anything that could help anchor the timeline. Now, Desiree is cooperative, Kane is cooperative, and Terry, she cooperates fully in the beginning until investigators begin to compare her account to the concrete data. Inconsistencies like her phone activity, her travel windows, her reported errands, and her unverified driving route. Now, these inconsistencies don't yet define her as a suspect, but they elevate her to something investigators call a critical witness, someone whose timeline must be precise, someone whose movements matter, someone who may hold the answer, even unintentionally. Over the next 72 hours, as teams continue searching, investigators begin narrowing their focus. The attendance anomaly, the missing minutes in the morning timeline, the movement between 8:45 a.m. and early afternoon. There's also the lack of physical evidence and the absence of any stranger-related leads. Also the inconsistencies emerging in early interviews. The clues seem to point inwards towards people who interacted with Kyron before school started. It doesn't mean investigators concluded guilt. It means they identified where more answers should exist and where the answers aren't adding up. Now, in missing child cases, that distinction is everything. By day 3, something becomes clear inside the command center. This isn't a case of a lost child in the woods, probably not an opportunistic stranger, and it isn't a misunderstanding. Detectives have a collection of clues, but they don't have a single piece of physical evidence. And in cases like this, No evidence is evidence. It means the disappearance was controlled. It was quick, it involved someone the child trusted, and it left behind a timeline with just enough information to see the outline, but not enough to see the whole picture. That's the moment the investigation shifts from search and rescue to a multi-year missing person investigation. When a child disappears, the first 48 hours are everything. Clues are fresh, witness memories are strongest, small details, the kind investigators usually never get, can change an entire case. Kyron's disappearance gave investigators something very unusual, a series of clues with no supporting physical evidence behind them. Within hours of Kyron being reported missing, Multnomah County mobilized what would become the largest search and rescue operation in Oregon state history. More than 1,300 search and rescue personnel, including ground teams, canine units, dive teams, mounted officers, aerial units with heat imaging equipment, and interstate searchers with specialized wilderness teams familiar with the hills and the ravines around Skyline Elementary. This was a big search. Even though the searchers found no physical trace of Kyron, they did uncover patterns investigators rarely talk about publicly, but which shaped critical decisions early on in the case. There were unusual quiet zones in the search grid. Search leaders identified pockets where wildlife, soil disturbance, and natural movement suggested no human activity at all during the window Kyron would have gone missing. Now, experienced trackers treat these quiet zones like negative fingerprints. Where nothing happened can be as revealing as where something did happen. There were heat signatures inconsistent with a child on foot. Helicopter sweeps picked up deer, dogs, joggers, maintenance workers, but no heat signatures matching a small child moving alone. The earliest dog teams didn't pull towards the woods. They actually pulled towards the parking areas and the road approaches. It's not a perfect indication of direction, but it was enough for investigators to start modeling possible vehicle-based removal scenarios. Again, not proof, but a pattern. Desiree didn't just express general concerns, she reported specific observations that investigators cataloged. Things like Terry's shifting tone in prior conversations, changes in Kyron's behavior when returning from the Horman home, comment Kyron made weeks earlier about a weird feeling that he got at school, frustrations Terry allegedly expressed about Kane and the household, workload, and a developing tension between Terry and one of Kyron's teachers. Kane provided information that investigators treated as highly actionable. His exact departure time for work is kind of murky. He had knowledge of Terry's usual driving patterns. There were prior discussions about Terry's stress levels. Another possible clue, the disappearance of an old flip phone from their house weeks before June 4th. Here's more data. Terry developed a sudden interest in gym activity and weight loss leading up to the day of the disappearance. There's also a suspicious text Terry received 2 days before the disappearance that she immediately deleted. Now, none of this proves any wrongdoing, but it expanded the investigative map dramatically. During one interview, Terry told investigators she changed baby Kay's diaper at a location that didn't match the surveillance imagery, another inconsistency in her story and timeline. Terry described Kyron's mood that morning differently in separate interviews. She misremembered which aisle she went down in one of the Fred Meyer stores. She couldn't recall whether she bought something that she later claimed she'd purchased. She also gave conflicting statements about whether she saw a particular school employee in the hallway. Now, individually, these are small fragments of potential clues. Collectively, investigators read them as micro-level inconsistencies, tiny misalignments that often emerge when someone's trying to reconstruct a timeline rather than simply remembering it. Another important distinction. Tips were coming in. Hundreds of them. Some were strange, some were credible, some shaped the direction of the case. Several drivers reported seeing a white pickup matching Terry's. It was sighted near Germantown Road, Skyline Road, and the turnoff near Newberry Road. Early in the investigation, a hiker reported seeing a man acting strangely near a trailhead west of Skyline. He was parked out of place and he was just staring at the tree line. He looked nervous. Now, this lead was taken seriously, but investigators cleared it within 2 days when his job timeline, the electronic timestamps, and his location data checked out. A rumor circulated early that Kyron was seen near a specific classroom that morning. Investigators spent days chasing it down. They interviewed students and reviewed staff statements. They cross-referenced it with known timings. In the end, it collapsed. Another dead end. Although full records are sealed, we know that Terry's phone connected to multiple tower sectors inconsistent with her stated route. At least 2 pings placed her vehicle farther west than expected. 1 ping occurred during the time when she was driving the baby around. Investigators didn't publicly accuse her of lying, but internally, this created a high-priority analysis zone. Terry reportedly said that she went to the gym at one point. Now, curiously, we don't see any record of her entering the gym in swipe logs, sign-in sheets, or surveillance footage. Again, small inconsistency, might be unimportant, but doesn't look too good. At this point, Kyron's disappearance was treated as a result of a sequence of actions. Actions that required access, timing, knowledge of routines, and an understanding of the building. A lot of moving parts. This is the point where the case stops being about the school and starts being about the people around Kyron, the 3 people investigators closely examined. Investigators never publicly named a suspect, but behind the scenes, in briefings, and in coordination with the DA's office, 3 names kept popping up. Let's examine each one. Terry Moulton Horman. Law enforcement agencies routinely bring in forensic interview specialists, people trained to study things like tone, pacing, memory structure, spontaneous detail, and emotional sequencing. Well, Terry's interviews displayed a number of these markings, like over-detailed sections about mundane tasks and under-detailed sections about important moments. Investigators noted shifts in Terry's narrative order between interviews. She showed unusual calm when describing the timeline gaps. Still, none of this proves any wrongdoing, but it's a red flag in interview psychology. Public sources mention only the main phone, but documents note that investigators discovered 3 active phones in the household. That's Terry's primary smartphone, an older flip phone, and a prepaid phone purchased earlier in the year. Now, only the primary phone's activity was initially disclosed. The presence of multiple devices begs questions. Why so many phones? Which phone was used when? Which pings belong to which device? And what, if any, messages were deleted? Investigators subpoenaed email accounts. They found deleted drafts and emails to a friend venting about Kane. Also, messages referencing feeling overwhelmed. A message in the days before the disappearance seemed to change tones abruptly mid-sentence. Again, it's not proof, but the DA's office treated these as behavioral evidence. Another clue. Terry baked cupcakes for Kyron's classroom the night before June 4th. She later referenced the cupcakes as if Kyron would be in class that day. Now this matters because Terry presented a morning plan anticipating a normal school routine, right? Yet Kyron was never marked present and no one saw him enter the class. Investigators interpret this as a clue pointing towards premeditation or routine expectation, depending on your point of view. Dee Dee Speecher wasn't on anyone's radar during the first hours of the investigation. She wasn't part of the science fair, she wasn't involved in the school routine, she wasn't even at Skyline Elementary. But as detectives traced movements, phone activity, and her social connections inside Terry's circle, her name popped up because of a strange gap in her own timeline on June 4th. Once investigators learned where she was that morning and what she was supposed to be doing, her absence stood out even more. On June 4th, Dee Dee was working as a gardener and a horticultural assistant on a large rural property in the Northwest Hills. That's around 6 or 7 miles from the Horman home. The homeowner she worked for described her as reliable and extremely focused. Her work required precision: watering schedules, pruning, soil preparation, hand weeding, managing irrigation lines, maintaining rows of vegetables and ornamental plants. Now this matters because the job environment was consistent and structured. Her tasks didn't change day to day. Her habits were predictable, but on June 4th, she deviated from the pattern. Witnesses at the property told investigators Dee Dee started her shift normally. She walked the perimeter of the garden beds and set down her tools. After that, she abruptly left the work area with no explanation. She just left and didn't return for roughly 90 minutes. Coworkers tried calling her. She didn't answer. They texted her. Nothing. Her phone was off or unreachable. When she finally returned, she didn't just get back to work completing her tasks. She paced. She looked unsettled, she avoided eye contact, and possibly most telling, she gave no clear explanation for where she'd been. For someone described as hardworking, detail-oriented, this behavior didn't match her established routine. It wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. When detectives later compared Dee Dee's disappearance from the garden to Terry's missing time window, the overlap was close enough that they flagged it immediately. 2 women who were close friends, living in the same social orbit, both unreachable during a similar part of the morning. Like all the clues we've seen so far, this by itself didn't prove anything, but it created a parallel timeline anomaly, something investigators investigators rarely ignore. After June 4th, Dee Dee displayed additional behaviors that investigators found concerning. She turned her phone off at unusual times and avoided conversations with coworkers. She distanced herself dramatically from routine work, and when detectives reached out, she became guarded. Now, investigators call this post-incident behavior divergence. It's a change in someone's behavior and habits triggered by a major event. Again, not evidence of guilt, but it adds context to her 90-minute disappearance. Multiple neighbors later reported something investigators took seriously. They saw Dee Dee's vehicle at or near the Horman residence in the days immediately following Kyron's disappearance. Now, not once, but multiple times. This implied more than casual friendship. It suggested coordinated contact. During the civil lawsuit brought by Kyron's mother, Dee Dee was subpoenaed for deposition, during which she invoked the Fifth Amendment over 70 times. She refused to answer questions about her movements, her relationship with Terry, her communications on the 4th, and whether she helped Terry in any capacity that day. Invoking the Fifth is a constitutional right, but in the grand scheme of things, it signaled one thing: exposure. Dee Dee's presence in the investigation wasn't about what she did, it was about what didn't add up. Let's talk about Rodolfo Sanchez, the landscaper. This is one of the most unusual threads in the entire case. Months before Kyron disappeared, Rodolfo Sanchez told investigators that Terry spoke angrily about her marriage. She discussed wanting Kane gone and asked if he knew anyone who could take care of it. For his part, Sanchez took a polygraph. It was administered by investigators, and he reportedly passed. This allegation became the basis for Kane's emergency restraining order, the sealed affidavit supporting it, and the court describing Terry as a danger in family filings. Now, understandably, this shifted the tone of the case entirely. Within the first 10 days, investigators constructed a relational map, and it didn't point outward towards strangers, drifters, and opportunistic offenders. It pointed inward, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because of dozens of tiny clues that formed a gravitational pull towards a small circle of individuals. This is how real investigations work. You don't find the suspect, the evidence does. Just 24 days after Kyron vanished, something unexpected happened. Kyron Horman filed an emergency restraining order against Terry. He told the court he feared for his safety. He submitted an affidavit that described a deeply alarming allegation. Months earlier, Terry allegedly approached a landscaper, Rodolfo Sanchez, and asked if he would take care of Kane. Investigators took this seriously enough to include it in their early case briefings. The landscaper, according to filings and interview summaries, confirmed the conversation. He cooperated with investigators. He passed a polygraph and provided details consistent over multiple retellings. Just days after reviewing the affidavit, the judge granted Kane full custody of baby K and ordered Terry out of the house. Now, one judge later described Terry in writing as a danger to the physical safety of the child. This isn't a criminal charge, but legally it's significant. Courts don't use that kind of language lightly. As the divorce proceedings accelerated, investigators gained access to financial records. I'm talking account statements, debit transactions, phone records tied to billing. They examined spending patterns and activity in the days leading up to June 4th. Attorneys noticed withdrawals that didn't match Terry's reported errands and fuel purchases inconsistent with her route. She also had no receipts for certain items that she said she bought. Like everything we've explained so far, these details didn't prove a crime, but they raised questions about who had access to money, which accounts were active, and whether financial stress played a role in the household tension. Lawyers issued a series of subpoenas. Phone companies to produce text logs, cell patterns, and cell tower data. Email providers to evaluate deleted drafts and written communication. Friends and associates, including one who reported sudden, unusual conversations with Terry after June 4th. They also subpoenaed Dee Dee, whose refusal to answer questions became a legal obstacle. Speaking of Dee Dee, let's look at the subpoena. It stands out. Dee Dee was commanded to produce records of calls and any written communication with Terry. She was compelled to disclose her whereabouts between specific times on June 4th and any items related to Kyron or the Horman household. When she was later deposed, we know she repeatedly invoked the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. Dee Dee's knowledge, or her fear of mischaracterization of that knowledge, was significant enough to create legal risk. While most court documents remained sealed, several statements became public because they were referenced in filings or quoted in hearings. Judge Cantor described Terry as the primary focus of the investigation. The DA's office confirmed Terry was the target of the missing persons case. Desiree Desiree Young's attorneys argued that Terry's actions interfered with her parental rights. A detective testified in a pretrial hearing that Terry's statements contained multiple inconsistencies, and the sheriff's office confirmed that Terry failed an early polygraph. Now, these statements don't establish criminal guilt, but they illustrate what investigators were seeing through the lens of legal documentation, basically a convergence of behavioral red flags. In June 2012, 2 years after Kyron vanished, his mother Desiree Young filed a $10 million civil lawsuit against Terry. The lawsuit forced previously private information into the public view and revealed valuable information, like descriptions of the household stress and accounts of deteriorating relationships. Also, newly revealed text messages and notes about Terry's behavior in the months leading up to June 4th, and sworn statements that Terry displayed extreme hostility towards Kane. The lawsuit's purpose wasn't money, it was discovery. That's the legal process of forcing information to the surface, and it worked. It produced a new timeline. It refined phone activity logs and established behavioral profiles. It also produced records of Terry's communication patterns around the time Kyron disappeared. But just months later, Desiree dropped the suit. But not because the allegations were weak. It was because investigators asked her to. The civil case was interfering with their investigation. Detectives wanted Terry questioned under criminal, not civil protocols. Now, this is rare and telling. By the end of the proceedings, investigators learned a lot. They now had a pretty clear behavioral map of the adults closest to Kyron. None of these pieces or clues stand alone, but when connected, they form a framework. We see a portrait of a household moving towards a breaking point. The legal fallout didn't solve Kyron's disappearance, but it gave investigators a look at the environment in which it happened. Tempers were rising and relationships were unraveling. Investigators were left with something unusual. Not a single clear theory. They had several partial models, each supported by pieces of evidence and each with major holes and gaps. Let's walk through the major theories detectives considered. Maybe Kyron left the school building on his own, the wandering child theory. This was examined on day one because it's the most statistically common explanation for missing children, but this model began to fail almost immediately. For this theory to work, we'd expect to see Kyron leaving the hallway alone, walking past adults without being noticed, perhaps exiting through one of the several unlocked doors. Kyron would have needed to have navigated uneven terrain while leaving no scent trail. He somehow left no footprints and left no evidence behind. Investigators rejected this theory because lack of evidence. Search dogs found no path of egress. Thermal imaging showed no viable movement path. The witness placement in school made an unnoticed exit unlikely. Kyron had no established pattern of wandering, and no physical trace of him was recovered anywhere on campus. Now, this theory didn't survive long. It didn't explain the absence of sightings, and it didn't explain the missing time, so investigators moved on. Maybe a stranger took him from school, the opportunistic abduction theory. Now, this model is one the public imagines first. A stranger, a vehicle, a quick grab. But investigators knew early on that stranger abductions from inside schools are extraordinarily rare and require specific conditions. A stranger would need to enter a crowded school without drawing attention and approach Kyron without anyone recognizing the unfamiliar behavior. They'd have to physically remove Kyron without detection. A stranger would have to somehow leave the building with a child during peak parent traffic and then reach a vehicle that no one reported. Tough pill to swallow. Investigators found this highly unlikely. After all, they had no description of suspicious persons in or near the school. No witness reporting an unfamiliar adult with a child. There were no reports of strange vehicles. No internal footage. Also, no internal sightings. Stranger abductions almost always leave behind some kind of disturbance. This wasn't the case here, so this model lacked traction early on. Maybe a known adult removed Kyron from the building. The familiar person model. This is where investigators began focusing once the basic scenarios were ruled out. Now, for this theory to work, Kyron would need to have trusted the person enough to follow. There would need to be a moment of opportunity between the hallway and the classroom, and an adult familiar with the school layout. They need access to a vehicle and a reason to remove him discreetly. It's a controlled interaction that left no witnesses and no commotion. This theory gained traction because no signs of a struggle, no alarm raised inside the school, and no one recalled Kyron appearing frightened or distressed. Now, most known missing child cases involved someone in the child's circle. The theory aligned with the lack of on-foot evidence. It fit the timeline far more cleanly than some of the other scenarios, that's for sure. This doesn't identify who the adult was, but it explains how Kyron could disappear without being seen. Maybe something happened before Kyron reached class. The hallway intercept model. Now, this isn't a dramatic theory, it's a procedural one. It was considered because the last confirmed moment places Kyron in a a transition zone between science fair and the classroom. This suggests Kyron never made it into class. A trusted person intercepted him, maybe a quick redirection followed by an exit path not monitored closely during the fair. In fact, no one saw him enter class, and teachers assumed he was somewhere else. The hallway movement was unverified. It explained the complete absence of classroom sightings and aligned with the attendance anomaly. It fits the controlled removal indicators for search data, but again, this is not an accusation towards a specific person, it's investigative logic. Another theory centered around an event occurring off-campus during the missing time, the off-site scenario. If the evidence isn't at the point of disappearance, sometimes it's at the point of opportunity. So for this theory to work, we'd expect to find Kyron being removed from the building early, a vehicle, and travel during Terry's unaccounted time. Investigators didn't reject it because Terry's timeline had unverified movement windows. Remember the cell phone tower activity? It raised geographic questions. Lots of concealed locations to hide a body in the rural area surrounding the school. This theory explains the total absence of evidence at Skyline and was consistent with search dog patterns pointing towards the parking areas. Now, this scenario became one of the central investigative possibilities because it explained the entire pattern of absence, invisibility, and time gaps. Then there's the accomplice theory. Investigators didn't publicly endorse this, but their actions, subpoenas, interviews, and follow-up questions show that they considered it. This is where Dee Dee's speecher, Michael Cook, and the others in Terry's orbit became relevant. Investigators noted Dee Dee's 90-minute disappearance, along with Terry's inconsistent timeline. Now, phone activity showed unusual patterns, and Dee Dee's visits to the Horman home after Kyron vanished raised eyebrows. Let's not forget the civil deposition where Dee Dee invoked the Fifth Amendment repeatedly. This theory doesn't assign guilt, but it reflects the investigative practice. Two timelines misalign in similar ways. When this happens, detectives check for overlap. Maybe something happened inside the home before or after the drop-off. This theory was heavily debated among detectives. The tensions inside the household and the landscaper allegation implied prior hostility. Now, the theory failed to gain traction because multiple independent witnesses saw Kyron alive at the science fair. Remember that 8:45 a.m. photo? That's definitive. It's irrefutable even, so a home-based event doesn't fit the timeline. Lastly, every major missing person case has a final bucket. It's the scenario that exists because investigators know that real life doesn't always fit into clean theories. Things like rare medical events, unforeseen accidents, interactions with individuals unknown to the parties, human error, things investigators simply can't identify. This theory has some supporting factors. There's no body, no physical evidence, no confirmed sequence of Kyron's last steps. There's also no confessions. But in the absence of physical evidence, this theory remains relevant. Each of these theories points to one central theme. For Kyron Horman to disappear without a trace, two things had to happen: opportunity and access. Just so happens that people with both were already in the building and already near him during the final verified moments of his life. 15 years after Kyron Horman walked into Skyline Elementary and vanished, his case remains officially active. Investigators from Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the District Attorney's Office continue to work the case today, but the work looks very different than it did in 2010. This phase of the investigation involves reconstruction. Around the 10-year mark, Multnomah County assigned a new group of detectives to re-examine Kyron's case. In 2020, the Sheriff's Office confirmed they were digitizing the entire case. One of the most common misconceptions about this case is the belief that the investigators aren't doing anything because they don't provide updates. But keep in mind that missing child cases that are still open, especially ones where investigators believe that they know the general shape of what happened, are intentionally quiet. Revealing where they searched, what they found, or what didn't match would compromise the integrity of the case. What they have said publicly is limited but important. There's information that can't be released because it goes directly to the heart of the investigation. So the good news is that this isn't a hopeless case. Investigators indicated directly and indirectly that they believe they know the general scenario of what happened. They also believe that the responsible party or parties have been interviewed. The police have evidence they haven't released and are waiting for either a confession, a disclosure, or a new piece of data illuminated by modern technology. This isn't speculation. It's drawn from public statements, court filings, DA-level commentary, and investigator interviews over the past decade. Kyron's case is far ahead of a typical cold case. We're coming up to the home stretch. This is the last mile or so. While the large-scale searches ended years ago, there have been quiet, targeted searches conducted as late as 2023 and 2024. They weren't publicized, they were leaked through local reporting. There were also private sector search organizations lending their own expertise, along with drone teams, sonar specialists, and volunteer investigators. Now, they periodically collaborate with law enforcement to carry out precision searches in areas identified by digital models. Nothing has been found, but the fact that these searches are still happening tells us something. Investigators haven't switched to a recovery-only mindset. They still believe Kyron's case can reach a new investigative phase. As far as where the family stand now, well, Desiree Young is still active in public updates and advocacy. She attends events honoring Kyron. She's repeatedly said somebody knows the answer. She continues to be in close contact with investigators. Kyron Horman lives a private life, limited public comments. He cooperates fully with investigators, and he maintains that the case is solvable. Terry Horman's moved states multiple times. She's changed residences repeatedly. She appeared in several court proceedings unrelated to Kyron's case, and has consistently denied any involvement in Kyron's disappearance. Baby K is now a teenager. Her privacy is protected by both parents and the court. Investigators don't discuss her publicly. As of today, the case remains active. Investigators maintain a narrowed focus. The sheriff's office continues to digitize and analyze the records, while the DA's office retains a file ready for a potential action. The FBI continues to support through tech and data, and the family continues to advocate. So far, no leads have ever redirected investigators outside the inner circle. So, the question is no longer whether the case can be solved. The question is, when will the right piece of information align with what investigators already know? Kyron Horman's disappearance isn't a single mystery. It's many. It's the mystery of a child who walked through a crowded building and vanished without being seen. Adults whose stories don't really line up. Also a school morning that should have been ordinary. If you know anything that might help shed light on Kyron's disappearance, please call your local police or email us at ash@americasstrangeshistory.com. Till next time, I'm John Genua, and you've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.